On August 30th, 2022, Mikhail Gorbachev died at the age of 91, the last ruler of the USSR, the first president of the Soviet Union, the first leader of the USSR after Lenin to have a higher education, a man who by some miracle came to power at 55 in a country ruled by 80-year-old half-living mummies, the man who ended the Cold War, the leader who failed miserably and destroyed the largest state on earth. The opinion on Gorbachev in today's society is very ambivalent. Outside of Russia, he is adored. Inside of Russia, there are many people who hate him with passion. However, almost everyone recognizes his importance to the modern world. For me, the most remarkable thing here is how both Vladimir Putin and Alexei Navalny reacted to Gorbachev's death. Their words were almost identical, that the man turned out to be a key figure for the entire course of the world history. So today, let's talk about three things. About what Mikhail Gorbachev managed to do, about what he failed to accomplish, and finally about what did he want to do.
Дорогие соотечественники, сограждане.
Those who have been following my channel for a long time know my feelings about Gorbachev. I sympathize with him as a man who was not afraid to shoulder the responsibility of saving a country that was steadily sliding into the abyss. But he did not succeed. This is why I cannot evaluate Mikhail Gorbachev highly as a ruler of my country. I talked about this both in my video about the tier list of rulers of Russia and in the video about the collapse of the USSR. Nevertheless, there is no denying that he took some right steps, of course, but it was not enough. Let's start with them. 30 years ago, Mikhail Gorbachev lost his fight for power to Boris Yeltsin. And back then, it seemed that it was Yeltsin who would build a new, free, democratic country on the ruins of the Soviet Union. But now they are both gone. Boris Yeltsin even has an entire memorial complex erected in Yekaterinburg. When you visit it, you realize that most of the merits attributed to Boris Nikolaevich, in fact, belong to Gorbachev. Free elections, freedom of speech, freedom to leave the country, liberation of the church, and even the presidential form of government are all Gorbachev. And all that is left of Yeltsin is the constitution, which gives the president almost unlimited power, and the choice of a successor who enjoys this power. So when we talk about Gorbachev's positive deeds, we should not think primarily about what he did for the USSR, because he kinda ruined it, but what he did for the future of Russia and the entire world. It was he who stopped the war in Afghanistan and the nuclear arms race. In fact, it was he who reassured millions of people who had been living in constant fear of a possible nuclear war for 40 years. Gorbachev said that he refused to press the nuclear button even in training, because he had seen videos of nuclear tests where flames devoured houses and cows and sheep, the same cows and sheep he used to herd as a child. His haters accused him of giving up those countries that had been in the socialist bloc for over 40 years too easily. To which he always asked in response, and who did I give them to? Germany to the Germans, Poland to the Poles, Czechia to the Czechs? Who should I have given them to? Perhaps this was not the wisest solution for an empire, and the Soviet Union with its bloc was certainly an empire. But it's definitely the best outcome for other individual countries into which the empire has disintegrated. At the same time, we cannot say that Gorbachev did nothing good for the USSR. Not even a year after he came to power, the USSR announced a policy of perestroika. He really made a mistake with the order of actions, forgetting that the transition from authoritarianism to democracy is good, but the issue of people needing to eat something is slightly more important. But otherwise he gave people an unprecedented amount of freedom. For the first time since the 1917 revolution, the Soviet Union had a free media. Mikhail Gorbachev was the first and only leader of the USSR to be severely criticized in the Soviet papers. By the way, the famous glasnost originally did not refer to freedom of speech. It referred precisely to the fact that it was impossible to keep silent about various economic problems in the field, as was customary in the past. He was the first leader of the country who acknowledged the technological backwardness of the Soviet Union compared to the West and tried to fix it. Unfortunately, he started with the wrong industry, but more about that later. In 1986, Mikhail Gorbachev had signed the law on individual labor activity. For the first time since the days of the NEP, private entrepreneurs appeared in the USSR. The cooperative movement began to develop, which would become the basis for private business in modern Russia. Before Gorbachev, there had been elections in the country, but there was always only one candidate. The reforms initiated by Gorbachev made it possible to hold the first real elections of People's Deputies of the USSR in 1989. This led to the fact that the new composition of the Congress of People's Deputies included, for example, 7 priests. He opened the closed and classified archives, made many of the crimes of communism known, and mostly the crimes against its own people. Under Gorbachev, the process of restoring Soviet citizenship for deprived and exiled dissidents began, and a broad campaign was launched to rehabilitate victims of political repressions. In the end, he was able to honestly and calmly accept his defeat, although in theory he could have drowned the country in another civil war. But it wasn't all good. Gorbachev as a global politician is certainly a positive figure, as a domestic leader, not so much. And in the early 90s he was extremely unpopular with both the democratically inclined and the pro-communist parts of the society. The latter simply hated him, accused him of the collapse of the USSR, of defeating the Cold War, of being an agent of the West, and generally being part of some global plan for the collapse of the Union. The former thought he was a man who was often late in making important decisions, and did not understand the rapidly changing situation. His attachment to the idea of socialism with a human face also hindered him. He understood the need for change in Soviet society, but either did not grasp the magnitude of the problems or simply was not ready to completely abandon his socialist ideals upon which he was raised. Or maybe he focused too much on working with Western countries, forgetting that the leader of a country should deal first and foremost with his own country. The main factor that weakened the Soviet Union is well known: high commodity prices, which allowed it to avoid reforms and cover deficit holes with imports. New Zealand meat was cheaper than domestic one. As a result, the USSR became the largest food importer in the world. By the early 1980s, the excess of imports over exports was more than $15 billion. Grain purchases reached 46 million tons by 1984, up from 2.2 million in 1970. It was necessary to urgently reform agriculture, and this is where Gorbachev made a mistake. His team focused on the development of mechanical engineering, but the gamble did not work out. There was a lack of funds for other important sectors of the economy, including the food industry. Gorbachev's team paid special attention to strengthening the human factor by reinforcing discipline and encouraging new forms of labor. On May 7, 1985, the CPSU Central Committee adopted a decree on measures to overcome drunkenness and alcoholism and launched the so-called anti-alcohol campaign. And this program was an excellent example of Gorbachev's misguided methods. Drunkenness in the country had really reached critical limits, but the measures taken to eradicate it proved to be crudely straightforward, ineffective, and had extremely harmful consequences. Vineyards were cut down, wineries were destroyed, and as a result, the number of drug addicts and substance abusers increased. People just began making moonshine at home. As a result, people did not drink less, but the profits from the sale of alcohol went into the black market, from the hands of the state into the hands of the criminal world. Gorbachev was either unable or afraid to solve all the accumulated problems quickly. Unable to find an optimal version of reforms, Gorbachev sought temporary compromises which were only half measures. The former economic model was no longer viable, but an instant transition to the market would have been too severe of a shock. As a result, there were no even local economic successes under Gorbachev in the USSR. Glasnost and freedom of speech? Great, but in 1986 the scale of the Chernobyl disaster was for some reason hushed up, just like in the good old days. Elections. But Gorbachev still refused to call a national election for president in 1990, and instead arranged to elect the president of the USSR with the votes of the people's deputies. Had he been the president-elect of the people, he could have held the Soviet Union in his hands a year later. He promised social reforms, but in the end he did not fulfill people's expectations, giving only a small raise to pensions and salaries, for which little could be bought at that time. He launched a long overdue political reform, but ended up depriving himself of the support of the almighty party without actually fixing anything. In addition, we should not forget Mikhail Gorbachev's dark side. I have mentioned that he gave freedom to the Poles, Germans and Czechs. Eventually, he gave it to the Lithuanians, the Georgians and the Azerbaijanis, but at what cost? Lithuania remembers a bloody Sunday on January 13, 1991, when the Soviet tanks entered Vilnius. It was Gorbachev. Then there was a shootout between the pro-Latvian police and pro-Soviet riot police in Riga, killing a total of 9 people. That's also Gorbachev. The entry of Soviet troops into Baku in January of 1990, when soldiers dispersed in rallies, killed more than 100 civilians. That was Gorbachev too. Since the end of 1990, Gorbachev has been trying on the role of dictator for some reason. Unprecedentedly harsh monetary reform in 1991. Banknotes of the old type turned into dust within a day. Those who did not have time to exchange them for new ones according to a strict fixed rate lost their cash savings. At the end of 1990, popular TV programs are shut down. Television hosts disloyal to Gorbachev are fired. The famous dissident Valeria Novodvorskaya is imprisoned under a new criminal article on insulting the president. Only 5 years into perestroika, and dissidents are being imprisoned again? Interior Minister Puga initiates joint patrols with the army, supposedly to maintain public order, but everyone understands that it is to suppress protests. Gorbachev is gradually turning away from all those who worked with him on perestroika. Gorbachev realizes that he is moving in the wrong direction and stops, but it is too late. He has no supporters left, and no way to save the collapsing Soviet Union. And the blame for this, obviously, lies with him. In order to fully understand what Mikhail Gorbachev wanted, it is necessary to understand what country he came to power in. And he came to power in a country whose top brass had not wanted anything for a long time. The funny thing is, he was the first Soviet leader born in a Soviet country. The first Soviet leader who had lived the normal life of a normal Soviet person. He came to the Politburo, which was already reaching the end of its life, consisting of people who had risen to the top of power so long ago that they had forgotten what they wanted to do with it. The young, semi-literate provincial careerists of the 30s, who were used to fill the positions vacated due to executions and imprisonments during the Great Terror. These were the very people who were the faces of the Soviet Union in the 70s and 80s. People who all their lives were engaged in the power struggle for a warm place higher in the party. People who did not know any other normal human life, with rare, very rare exceptions. They were no longer the kind of revolutionaries who wanted to light the whole world on fire. They were people who lived in mutual fear and hatred for decades, and who had absolutely no idea what to do with the huge country they had inherited. So they preferred to do nothing. Or make bizarre decisions, such as appointing the half-dead Chernenko to the post of General Secretary, or sending troops into faraway Afghanistan, or agreeing to the utopian project of turning back the Siberian rivers instead of implementing gradual and adequate reforms. Against this backdrop, the 54-year-old Gorbachev who came to power was a normal person. A person who did not spend 50 years of his life in endless inner-party bickering. And that is probably why he was able, in general, to remain human, even after spending 6 years in power in a half-destroyed empire. An empire he probably didn't destroy after all. He just came to the ruins and didn't manage to rebuild it. But this doesn't mean that he didn't try. Gorbachev understood that it was impossible to do without perestroika, because the USSR had become a state imitation, where people pretended to work and the state pretended to pay them and take care of them. Did he have an option to pretend that everything is fine and prolong the life of the USSR for another 10 to 15 years? Yes, probably, but Gorbachev wanted changes. The country wanted changes, and he tried to bring them. At the same time, it is often suggested among Gorbachev's opponents that he secretly hated everything Soviet and wanted the collapse of the socialist country. This is not true. Gorbachev really believed in socialism and admired the works of Lenin, and he wanted to turn the country back to the ideals of its creator. Unfortunately, this is what ruined the country in a way. He wanted to modernize the economy, but he did not have time to do so. Goods began to disappear from the shelves, and the only way to fix it quickly would be to launch a completely free market and free prices. This was in complete contradiction to Gorbachev's main political idea of preserving socialist dogma and party control. China was able to gradually introduce elements of a market economy, preserving the total control of the party. But they did have time. The USSR did not. Nevertheless, Gorbachev tried to think of a way out of this deadlock, and unfortunately was stuck between two extremes in a kind of a middle state. Although initially he understood the scale of the changes needed, as far back as 1986 he called perestroika a new revolution. But he was too eager to keep the USSR as it had been for 70 years. And in the same lineup, although he probably knew that it would be impossible to keep the Baltic and Caucasian republics. Unlike Boris Yeltsin and his supporters, who wanted to end socialism at once and establish a policy of radical liberalism. Gorbachev believed until the last days of his life that the USSR could have been saved, even after the 1991 August coup, by creating a union of sovereign states, each with a seat in the United Nations, but with a common security system and control of nuclear weapons. But no one needed such half-hearted solution anymore. I think Mikhail Gorbachev should be remembered first and foremost not as a politician, but as a human being, as a man who won the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts to prevent a nuclear war, or who won, for example, a Grammy for his voiceover of the musical tale Pizza and the Wolf. As a man who did not fight for power after the signing of the Belavesh Accords, because he recognized his mistakes of Vilnius and Baku and did not want more bloodshed. The man who showed that the leader of the Soviet Union was not some deity from Olympus, but an ordinary man who starred in Pizza Hut or Louis Vuitton commercials, who adored his wife and after her death recorded a charity music album in her honor. Yes, Mikhail Gorbachev was certainly not the best leader in the history of the Soviet Union, but he was the most human of them all.